In his room, little Leo stacked wooden blocks with absolute concentration. The silence in the room was total, a stillness that had settled over the house exactly 1 year ago. On the same day, an accident took his mother. Since then, Leo's voice had disappeared along with her. The house, once full of life, now seemed too large, and the boy took refuge in his corner, creating tall towers that always ended up falling. Those blocks were his only means of expression, a way to bring some order to the chaos he felt inside. For him, each piece was an unspoken word, each structure a feeling he couldn't show any other way. He lived isolated in his own world, a safe haven where the pain of grief couldn't so easily reach him. A new caregiver, Clara, arrived that morning. As she approached Leo's room, she stopped at the door, making no sound. Instead of entering and interrupting him, she just watched the scene for a moment. Her eyes didn't convey the pity or concern Leo was used to receiving from adults. There was a genuine curiosity in her gaze as she analyzed the tower the boy was building with such care. She noticed the firmness of his small hands and the logic behind each movement. Clara understood that this wasn't just a pastime, it was his language. By respecting that space and that moment, she showed a sensitivity that no one else had. She didn't see a child with problems, but a boy communicating in the only way he could. That's a very tall tower. It's beautiful work, Clara said, in a calm, low voice that didn't startle the silence but blended with it. The effect was immediate. Leo froze, the block he was about to place on top of the tower hovering in his hand. He lifted his face and looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. It was a reaction he hadn't had in months. People usually talked to his father about him, or gave him direct orders. No one had ever commented on his constructions, much less praised his effort. In that moment, Clara didn't treat him like a patient or a task, but simply as a boy building something he was proud of. This simple act of acknowledgement opened the first small crack in his wall. Clara approached slowly and sat on the floor, at a respectful distance, to be on the same level as him. She opened her bag and took out a small set of finger puppets. They were simple puppets, made of colored felt, but they seemed vibrant in that room of neutral tones. "I brought some friends who really wanted to meet the famous tower builder," she said, in a friendly tone, placing a little lion on her finger. Her attitude wasn't that of a therapist applying a technique, but of someone who genuinely wanted to play. She didn't ask him to speak or interact. She just presented a new possibility, a playful and pressure-free form of communication, letting him decide whether or not he wanted to join in this new game. With a high-pitched, funny voice, Clara made the felt lion puppet move. "Wow! What a huge castle! Can I come visit?" Leo's gaze, previously lost, was now completely focused on the little puppet dancing on the caregiver's finger. He watched every movement, his serious expression slowly being replaced by a childlike curiosity that hadn't appeared in a long time. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, an almost imperceptible twitch. It was the beginning of a smile, a reflex his face seemed to have forgotten how to make. It wasn't a laugh, not even a full smile, but for a child who hadn't shown emotion in a year, that small gesture was a seismic event, a sign that something was finally changing inside him. Hidden in the hallway, Arthur, Leo's father, saw everything. He felt his legs weaken and had to lean against the wall. For a year, he had spent a fortune on the best specialists, men and women who promised results and delivered only frustrating reports. All of them had failed to make any kind of connection with his son. Now this woman, in less than 10 minutes, using only her sensitivity and a cheap puppet, had elicited a reaction he thought he would never see again. A wave of hope, so intense it was painful, washed over him. Who was this woman? And more importantly, would she be able to bring his son back from the silence for good? That small, faint smile was the first light at the end of a very long and dark tunnel. Will Clara be able to break Leo's silence forever? If you're rooting for him, Like this video, subscribe to follow the rest of the story, and leave a message of strength for little Leo in the comments. Arthur lived an exhausting double life. By day, he was a successful businessman, a man who commanded meetings and made million-dollar decisions with unshakable confidence. His world was made of numbers, goals, and results. But upon crossing the gates of his own home, that armor fell away. At night, he was just a widowed father, haunted by the silence of a home that was once filled with the laughter of his wife and son. The mansion, with its large, empty rooms, became a labyrinth of loneliness. He had all the comfort money could buy, but he felt like the poorest man in the world, for he could not purchase peace for his home, nor a voice for his son. This contradiction consumed him slowly, day after day. The last year had been a desperate pilgrimage through specialists' offices. Arthur spared no expense in the search for a solution to Leo's silence. He hired the most renowned child psychologists, speech therapists with the best credentials, and even neurologists who ran a battery of tests. Each specialist brought a new promise, an innovative method, but the result was invariably the same. The sessions were clinical and impersonal, and Leo retreated even further in the presence of those strangers. For Arthur, each failed consultation was more than a disappointment. It was a confirmation of his own powerlessness. He, the man who solved any problem in the business world, was unable to alleviate his own son's suffering, which plunged him into a feeling of guilt. Communication between father and son had become purely functional, a script of practical actions without any emotional warmth. Arthur ensured that Leo was well fed, clothed, and safe, but the connection between them had been broken. Attempts at conversation died in the air, turning into painful monologues that only widened the distance. Many nights, Arthur would just stand at the bedroom door, watching Leo stack his blocks, feeling like a spectator in his son's life. The love he felt was immense, a force that drove him to keep fighting, but the pain and grief had made him clumsy. He no longer knew how to reach the boy on the other side of that abyss of silence, and this was his greatest anguish. The memory of his wife was still alive in every corner of the house. A picture frame in the living room, which he avoided looking at for too long, held the smile that used to brighten his days. Sometimes he thought he could hear the echo of her laughter, which made the current quietness even more oppressive. After her death, Arthur closed himself off from the world and his own feelings, believing that rigidity was the only way to stay standing to care for Leo. He buried his pain so deep that he forgot how to feel anything else. Living became an exercise in survival, one day at a time, without allowing any new emotion, good or bad, to destabilize the fragile order he had built to avoid completely falling apart. The decision to hire Clara was not born of new hope, but of pure exhaustion. The previous caregivers couldn't stand the heavy atmosphere of the house or Leo's complete lack of reaction, and they quit. Arthur needed someone, anyone, just to ensure the boy wasn't alone while he worked. He barely looked at Clara's resume. The agency recommended her, and that was enough. For him, it was just an administrative hire, a piece to be fitted into the complex machinery of his routine. He didn't expect a miraculous solution or a special connection. Clara was, in his mind, just another employee, someone to fulfill a practical function in a house where hope had been dismissed long ago. But that moment in the hallway, seeing Leo's face light up with the shadow of a smile, turned Arthur's world upside down. In less than 10 minutes, that simple woman had achieved more than all the expensive specialists combined. The image contrasted sharply with the entire year of sterile treatments and failed efforts. It was a shocking revelation. He realized he had tried to fix his son, as if Leo were a broken project, applying resources, logic, and the best available expertise. In that instant, Arthur understood that the problem was never a lack of technique, but a lack of human warmth. Leo didn't need a therapist to analyze him. He needed a friend who would sit on the floor to play with him. 2 days later, an elegant woman parked her imported car in front of the mansion. It was Dr. Helen Sawyer, the child psychologist who had been treating Leo for 8 months. With her leather briefcase and an air of quiet authority, she represented the clinical, methodical approach in which Arthur had placed all his faith. She greeted him with a professional nod, offering a restrained smile that was more protocol than warmth. To Helen, Leo was one of her most challenging cases, a complex puzzle she was determined to solve. Her confidence in her own methods was absolute, and she saw the boy's progress as a slow, scientific process, of which she was the sole architect and engineer. During the session, Helen noticed a slight improvement in Leo's interaction. He seemed a bit more present, less submerged in his private world. At the end, she addressed Arthur with an air of satisfaction. "He's starting to respond better. Our sessions are finally breaking through the first barriers," she stated, adjusting her glasses. To her, any progress was a direct credit to her hard work and strategic patience. She saw herself as the savior, the only professional capable of guiding the boy out of the darkness. This small improvement was the proof she needed that her approach, though slow, was the only correct one, reinforcing her position as an indispensable expert in the family's life. Moved by an almost naive sincerity, Arthur shared the news that excited him. "I think the new caregiver has been helping too. Her name is Clara." Upon hearing this, Helen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes, previously relaxed, gained a sharper, more analytical focus. "A new caregiver," she repeated, her tone carefully neutral but unable to hide a note of alarm. "And what are her qualifications? Does she have experience with cases like Leo's?" The question sounded like a risk assessment, a sudden investigation into a variable she hadn't anticipated and, more importantly, couldn't control. The presence of another person influencing her patient was an unwelcome complication. Without waiting for a full answer, Helen adopted her expert posture. "Arthur, I need to be very clear," she began, her voice firm. "Children who have experienced severe trauma require an extremely stable and controlled environment. The interference of people without adequate training, no matter how well-intentioned, can be disastrous." Her words were like stones, each one chosen to build a wall of doubt in Arthur's mind. "We could regress by months in just a few days. All of our work could be lost." It was a veiled warning, a maneuver to disqualify any progress that didn't come directly from her and to reassert her authority as the sole guardian of Leo's well-being. At that exact moment, as if fate wanted to prove a point, the therapy room door opened. Leo walked out, and upon seeing Clara waiting in the hallway, his face transformed. The mask of apathy he constantly wore simply melted away, replaced by a genuine, radiant smile. He didn't say a word, but ran towards her, a swift and purposeful movement. The boy took Clara's hand and began pulling her towards the kitchen, pointing at the window, eager to show her something. The entire scene, vibrant with affection and spontaneity, was an undeniable demonstration of the deep connection the two had formed in a surprisingly short time. Arthur watched the scene, his eyes shining with emotion. He turned to Helen, happiness overflowing in his voice. "Did you see that? He never acts like that with anyone." He smiled, he said, as if presenting proof of a miracle. He expected the doctor to share in his joy, to see it as the major breakthrough it was, but the expression on Helen's face was different. She held a forced smile on her lips, but her eyes were cold, calculating. She didn't see a happy boy. She saw her authority being undermined, her patient forming a bond with a person she considered inadequate. And worst of all, she saw the success of an amateur where she, the specialist, was still struggling for results. "This is exactly what I was mentioning," Helen said, her voice regaining its professional calm, but with a graver tone. She skillfully twisted reality to fit her narrative. This isn't necessarily a good sign, Arthur. What you're seeing is a symptom of insecure attachment. He's projecting his neediness onto a new, unprepared figure, which can create a very dangerous emotional dependency. She used her technical terminology as a weapon, turning a moment of pure joy into a worrying clinical picture. With a few sentences, she managed to wipe the smile from Arthur's face and replace it with a new layer of anxiety, reaffirming that only she understood the complexity of the situation. Helen said her goodbyes with a few more recommendations, leaving Arthur confused and worried. As she walked to her car, her facade of professionalism crumbled, revealing an expression of pure irritation. A simple caregiver was not going to ruin her plans. Leo's treatment was only part of her project. She had invested months building a relationship of trust with Arthur, positioning herself as a central and indispensable figure in his life. Clara's arrival was a direct threat to that position. The battle for Leo's well-being had just become, in Helen's mind, a power struggle, and she had no intention of losing to someone she considered so insignificant. Clara didn't follow psychology manuals or apply complex techniques. Her approach was much simpler and came from a place of pure intuition. To her, Leo wasn't a clinical case to be deciphered, but a sad child who needed a safe space to feel. She didn't try to force speech or impose activities. Instead, she focused on creating small moments of normalcy and affection. Her method was patience. She knew how to wait. She understood that the trust of a wounded child is not demanded, but earned. Every day she was simply there, present and calm, offering her company without asking for anything in return, believing that healing would happen on Leo's time, not on the adult's time. Since words were not part of Leo's world, Clara found another way to communicate: drawing. She spread sheets of paper and colored pencils on the floor and began to draw simple things, never pressuring him to participate. The first day, she drew a smiling sun. The next day, she found a small drawing of a gray cloud next to her sun, made by him. It was the beginning of a silent dialogue. She drew birds in a nest. He responded with a lone bird on a distant branch. Through lines and colors, Leo began to externalize the landscape of his soul, showing her his loneliness, his fears, and little by little his small hopes, and Clara listened to every image with her heart. One afternoon, as they were drawing side by side in the garden, Leo pointed to a ladybug that had landed on a leaf. He leaned close to Clara, and in an almost inaudible sound, a breath of a voice, he whispered, "Look." Clara's heart leaped, but she contained her emotion so as not to startle him. She just smiled and replied in the same low tone, "I see it. How beautiful." From that day on, whispers became their secrets. Short words like blue, flower, or the name of his felt lion, Juba, were spoken only when they were alone. They were fragile sounds, but to Clara, they sounded like the most powerful orchestra. Leo's voice wasn't lost. It was just sleeping, waiting for a safe reason to awaken. Without them noticing, Arthur became a constant observer of these moments. From his office window or the crack of the door, he watched this magical interaction. He saw the light in his son's eyes, the relaxation in his shoulders, and he heard the rare whispers that were like music to his ears. The gratitude he felt for Clara was overwhelming, but he realized it was turning into something more. He found himself captivated by her patience, by the way she celebrated each of Leo's small victories, by the light she brought into the dark corners of that house. He no longer saw just his son's caregiver. He saw a woman whose kindness was healing. Not only Leo, but him as well. One day, upon entering the kitchen, he found Clara humming a lullaby while cleaning the counter. She turned, and upon seeing him, gave a spontaneous and radiant smile. It wasn't a polite gesture for her employer. It was a genuine smile that instantly warmed the room. In that moment, for the first time in over a year, Arthur felt a sense of home, Her presence, so simple and serene, filled the emptiness of the house in a way he didn't think was possible anymore. He realized that her arrival had not only brought progress for Leo, but also relief for his own tired soul. He was growing attached to the feeling of peace she effortlessly emanated. Clara, for her part, lived in a world apart from the complexities surrounding her. Completely dedicated to Leo, she didn't notice Arthur's lingering glances or Dr. Helen's veiled hostility during her visits. Her only concern was the boy's well-being. She measured the success of her days by the number of colored drawings on the refrigerator or the new word whispered in her ear. She treated Arthur with professional and cordial respect, maintaining a natural distance between employee and employer. She was so immersed in her mission to help Leo that she had no time or energy to decipher the silent dramas of the adults around her, which, unbeknownst to her, protected her from the brewing storm. As the weeks went by, the house began to have two distinct atmospheres. Leo's moments with Clara were light, creative, and filled with quiet discoveries and small joys. In contrast, the sessions with Helen were tense, structured, and left the boy visibly drained and apathetic. Arthur found himself in the middle of an invisible tug-of-war. On one side, Helen, with her degrees, her logic, and her warnings about the dangers of improvisation. On the other, Clara, with her visible results, her human approach, and a path to healing that, though unorthodox, seemed to be the only one that truly worked. The choice should have been obvious, but it involved challenging reason, social conventions, and the opinion of an expert he himself had hired. Arthur's internal conflict grew with each passing day. Everything he saw with his own eyes told him to trust Clara, to believe in the miracle unfolding before him. His son was coming back, little by little, and that was undeniable. However, Helen's words echoed in his mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear, and to complicate everything, he could no longer deny the feelings he was developing for the caregiver, an affection that scared him. To acknowledge this feeling would mean admitting a vulnerability he had tried to suppress for a long time. He was torn between what logic dictated and what his heart felt, a silent battle that would define his family's future. On a quiet afternoon, while Leo was taking his nap, Clara was enjoying a rare moment of peace in the kitchen. The silence was broken by the shrill ring of her cell phone. Seeing the hospital's name on the caller ID, her serene face instantly contorted into a mask of panic. Her relaxed posture gave way to a visible tension as she answered. The conversation was short, with Clara uttering only fragmented, anguish-filled phrases. "What do you mean it's worse? But the doctor didn't say surgery, urgent." Her voice, normally a calming balm for Leo, was now trembling, laden with a palpable fear. That phone call was a messenger of bad news, a storm forming on her personal horizon, threatening to destroy the fragile stability she cherished. As soon as she hung up, her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the phone. Disoriented, she grabbed a paper napkin and a pen and began to automatically scribble numbers. It was the cost of her mother's emergency surgery, a sum that, to her, seemed astronomical. Beside it, she wrote her bank account balance, the result of years of hard work and savings. The difference between the two numbers was an abyss, an impossible debt to pay. The reality hit her with the force of a punch. The woman who spent her days healing the pain of a wealthy family found herself completely helpless to save her own. She rested her head on the table, feeling the weight of the world crash down on her shoulders. Arthur entered the kitchen and found her in this state of silent desolation. He saw the tear-stained paper and the look of defeat on her face. Gently, he asked what had happened. With a choked voice, Clara explained the situation, her mother, the diabetes, the life-or-death operation. Arthur listened in silence and without a shred of hesitation made a decision that would change everything. "I'll pay for it," he said, his voice firm. "Don't worry about the money. Consider it handled." For him, it was a simple, logical choice. She was saving his son in a way no money could buy. Paying a hospital bill was the least he could do to repay the miracle she was performing in his house every day. The offer, though, generous, struck Clara in an unexpected way. She lifted her head, her eyes red, and immediately refused. "No, Mr. Arthur, I can't accept. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, but I can't." There was an unshakable strength in her refusal, even in her moment of greatest fragility. For her, accepting such a large sum from her employer would mean crossing an invisible line. It would change the dynamic between them, turning their professional relationship into something that would leave her in a position of debt and dependence. It was a matter of dignity. She needed to maintain her independence, even if it meant facing this overwhelming crisis on her own. Her honor, at that moment, was worth more than the financial relief. Arthur did not accept her refusal. He stepped closer, his expression softening, and insisted with a sincerity that disarmed her. "Clara, you don't understand. You gave my son his voice back. You're bringing happiness back to this house. That's priceless." He wasn't speaking like a boss, but like a deeply grateful father. "Let me do this for you. Not as a favor, but as a thank you. Please allow me to help save your mother just as you are saving my family." In his eyes, Clara saw more than just gratitude. There was an admiration, an affection, and a concern that transcended any working relationship. The air between them grew thick, charged with emotions they both had been trying to ignore. It was at that exact moment of tension that Leo appeared in the kitchen, sleepy, rubbing his eyes. He stopped and observed the two adults, sensing the heavy atmosphere in the room. He looked at Clara's distressed face and at his father's intense expression. Then, with the pure, disarming logic of a child, he asked the question that was floating invisibly between them. "Dad, do you like Clara?" The simple, direct question landed in the silent kitchen like a stone in a pond, creating shockwaves that hit them both. It was the naked truth, verbalized in the most innocent way possible, exposing the feeling that Arthur barely admitted to himself. Arthur was paralyzed, unable to formulate a response. Any word he said, a denial or a confirmation, would feel wrong. He just looked at Clara, and in his gaze, she found the answer he couldn't give. The awkwardness was almost unbearable. Leo, not understanding the complexity of what he had asked, continued with his childlike line of reasoning. "If you like her, is she going to be my new mom?" This second, even more direct question turned the situation from embarrassing to terrifying. It put on the table a future that neither of them had dared to contemplate, forcing them to face the implications of their feelings. The money problem, so urgent moments before, now seemed small in the face of this revelation. Finally, Arthur managed to speak, but his voice was weak. "Son, Clara is our friend. We were just talking," he said, an excuse that convinced no one. The conversation about the surgery was forgotten, but something much more profound had been planted. Leo's question, asked without malice, acted as a catalyst. It turned the unspoken feeling into a real possibility, an idea that now existed in the world. For Arthur, it was the door to a happiness he didn't feel he had the right to seek. For Clara, it was a complication that threatened her job and the peace of mind she worked so hard to maintain. The dynamic of the house had changed forever. The seed of the turning point had been planted. A child's purity can reveal the truths that adults are afraid to admit. Have you ever witnessed a moment like that, where an innocent question changed everything? Subscribe to the channel to see how Arthur and Clara will handle this revelation, and share your story in the comments. We want to know what it was like. Feeling she was losing control of the situation, Helen decided it was time to act more aggressively. That night, the image of the small, happy family on the living room floor wouldn't let her sleep. She got up and, with a calculated coldness, began to make a series of strategic phone calls. The first to receive her call was Arthur's brother, then one of his oldest business partners, and finally, an influential family friend. To each of them, she used the same tone of voice, that of a deeply concerned professional. She spoke of Arthur's vulnerability, suggested he was being manipulated by an employee, and expressed her fear of the impact this would have on Leo. She made no direct accusations, but she planted poisonous seeds of doubt, using her credibility as a doctor to turn Arthur's own circle of trust against Clara. The next day, Helen's offensive began to take effect. Arthur's phone didn't stop ringing. It was the same people Helen had spoken to, all expressing a sudden and strange concern about his personal life. The conversations were filled with phrases like, "Be careful, my friend," and "You need to think about your reputation," and, above all, Leo's well-being. Arthur hung up the last call, feeling confused and besieged. How could everyone have reached the same conclusion at the same time? The external pressure was suffocating. Suddenly, his refuge, his own home, was under the judgment of everyone he knew. The doubts Helen had planted in his mind were now reinforced by his friends and family, making him question his own perception of reality. Seeking a respite from all the tension, Arthur went to the playroom and found Clara and Leo sitting on the floor, molding figures out of modeling clay. For the first time, he joined them, sitting on the rug. In that safe environment, Leo spoke about his mother for the first time without sadness, asking about an old toy. Then, he looked at Clara with his innocent eyes and asked, "Where is Mommy now?" Arthur felt a lump in his throat, unable to answer. With infinite sweetness, Clara explained that his mother had become the brightest star in the sky and that she watched over him every night. The explanation touched Arthur so deeply that he felt his eyes well up. In that instant, the three of them formed a picture of perfect family harmony. The scene was abruptly interrupted by a sharp voice from the doorway. "Arthur, I need a word with you." Helen had arrived for her session and had witnessed the intimate moment. Her expression was a mask of ice. After Clara left with Leo, Helen closed the door, making it clear the conversation would be serious. "What did I just see here?" she demanded, her professional tone replaced by a poorly concealed anger. "You, sitting on the floor with this woman, acting like a happy family. Do you have any idea how harmful and confusing that is for your son? You're being manipulated under your own roof and you can't even see it." The accusation was brutal, framing a moment of healing as proof of his supposed irresponsibility. After Helen left, leaving behind a trail of poison and doubt, Arthur called Clara back into the room. He was pale, tormented. He told her about the calls, about the accusations, about the pressure he was under. "They think you're a danger to Leo. They think I'm not thinking straight," he confessed, the anguish clear in his voice. Seeing the conflict in his eyes, Clara asked the only question that mattered. "And what do you think?" The simple question cut through all the confusion. Arthur looked at her, at the woman who had brought his son back and who was now being attacked because of him. In an impulse that came from the heart, he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of certainty. The silent, definitive answer to her question. The kiss was a moment of pure, vulnerable truth, a silent promise that he would not abandon her. However, they were not alone. At the top of the stairs, hidden in the dimness of the hallway, Helen had not left. She had waited, sensing that something would happen. With a triumphant, vengeful smile on her lips, she raised her cell phone. The screen illuminated her face as she framed the scene perfectly. The sound of the camera's click was imperceptible to the couple. She had gotten exactly what she needed. It was no longer her word against theirs. Now, she had visual proof, the ultimate weapon she would use to destroy Clara's reputation and prove to Arthur once and for all that she had been right all along. Helen knew the photograph of the kiss was a powerful weapon, but to use it immediately would be a tactical mistake, revealing her hand. Instead, she opted for a slower, more effective psychological torture. The next morning, she called Arthur, adopting a soft, understanding tone. She asked how he was feeling after their difficult conversation the day before. She talked about how grief and loneliness can confuse emotions, leading to impulsive decisions and inappropriate attachments. Without ever mentioning the kiss, she made him feel as if his gesture had been a symptom of weakness, proof of his emotional instability. She was manipulating him into convincing himself that his feelings for Clara were a mistake. A few days later, the public humiliation was orchestrated. During a charity event at the country club, Clara was working an extra shift as a waitress to help with her mother's medical expenses. Helen, circulating among the tables with a glass of champagne, stopped near a group of influential women and began to speak, loudly enough to be heard, about how sad it was to see vulnerable men become prey for opportunistic employees. The sideways glances and poorly disguised whispers soon turned towards Clara as she passed by serving appetizers. The shame hit her full force, turning her face bright red. She was the target of a cold, calculated social execution. Unable to bear the silent slander, Clara walked up to the group and in a trembling voice asked Helen if she was talking about her. Helen responded with a cynical smile, feigning surprise and offense. At that exact moment, Arthur approached, drawn by the tension in the air. Clara looked at him, her eyes pleading for a defense, for a single gesture to validate her honor in front of everyone. But Arthur, paralyzed by social pressure and the fear of a scandal, only stammered an apology for the misunderstanding. His silence was a betrayal. Humiliated and feeling completely alone, Clara retreated, while Helen savored her victory, having proven to everyone that Clara was indeed unfit for that world. Clara arrived, home devastated, feeling she had lost everything. Her neighbor Sharon, a kind elderly woman with wise eyes, saw her crying on the porch and invited her in. After hearing the whole story, Sharon shook her head. "That woman doesn't hate you, my dear. She's jealous," she said firmly. "Jealous because you got what she wanted, the love of that boy and the attention of his father. People like that are dangerous and they don't play fair." Sharon's words were like a beacon in the darkness. "If you're going to fight, you can't do it on her turf. You have to fight with the one weapon she doesn't expect you to have, the truth. Go find out who she really is." Those words ignited a spark of determination in Clara. The next day, she went to an internet cafe and started researching Dr. Helen Sawyer. She found publications, interviews, her impeccable resume. It seemed like a dead end until she had the idea to add the word complaint to the search. That's when it appeared, a small article in an old newspaper about a father who had lost custody of his child following a psychological report signed by Helen. The article was vague, but it contained a name, Richard Miller. It was a lead, the first crack in the doctor's perfect facade. Clara wrote down the name, feeling that perhaps she was no longer fighting a lonely battle. With her heart pounding, Clara managed to find Richard's contact information and called him. As soon as she mentioned Helen's name, a heavy silence fell on the line. "That woman," he finally said, his voice laden with an old pain. "She ruined my life." Clara quickly explained her situation, the similarity between their stories creating an immediate bond between them. Richard agreed to meet her the same day. As she hung up, Clara felt a wave of strength. She wasn't the first victim. There was a pattern, a trail of lives affected by the same manipulative cruelty. Helen wasn't just a rival, she was a predator, and now Clara had a chance to find other survivors. They met in a coffee shop. Richard was a man whose sadness seemed to have permanently settled on his face. He told her how Helen, while treating his son, had gotten close to his ex-wife, poisoning their relationship with suggestions that he was an unfit and unstable father. "She painted me as the villain, convinced my wife that I was the problem." Her goal was never just to treat my son, but to get me out of the way. The story was a mirror of her own situation, a macabre script that Helen seemed to repeat with frightening precision. Every word from Richard was a confirmation that Clara's intuition had been right from the beginning. The worst part is, she succeeded, Richard continued bitterly. After we separated, she and my ex-wife had an affair. It didn't last long, but it was enough. He then showed Clara on his phone the proof he had kept for years. Compromising text messages from Helen, filled with manipulation and derogatory comments about him. They were the concrete evidence of her method. "Can I have copies of all of this?" Clara asked, her voice steady. Now she had not just a suspicion, but documentary proof of Helen's character. With those messages, the battle was no longer her word against that of the famous doctor. Filled with a new and fierce hope, Clara returned to the mansion, ready to show Arthur the truth. But as she entered the kitchen, her world collapsed. On the table, a white envelope held a letter of termination. In cold corporate language, Arthur dismissed her from her duties, citing the need for a more suitable professional environment for Leo's recovery. The irony was cruel. At the exact moment she found the weapons to fight for his family, he had already surrendered, giving in to all the pressure and lies. That paper was the certificate of his defeat, of his lack of faith in her and in his own feelings. At that moment, Leo ran down the stairs. "Clara, you're back. Dad said you weren't going to work here anymore," the boy said, confusion in his voice. He clung to her legs, panic beginning to fill his eyes. "Don't go, please, you promised." Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of suffering and guilt. In the harshest voice Clara had ever heard him use, he ordered Leo to go to his room. The boy obeyed, crying. The silence that fell between the two adults was deafening, filled with the child's pain and the shame of the man who had caused it. "I believed you were different," Clara said, her voice holding not hurt, but a deep disappointment. She faced him directly, forcing him to see the consequence of his weakness. "I thought you would fight, but you're a coward. It's easier to get rid of me than to face Helen and the judgment of your friends." She took a letter she had already written from her bag and placed it on top of his. "Don't worry, I quit." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Just one piece of advice. Don't let your fear destroy your son's progress." She walked out, with her head held high, leaving behind a man who, in trying to protect his world, had just destroyed his own heart. In the days that followed Clara's departure, the mansion once again became a mausoleum. The silence that returned was even heavier and more painful than before, as it was now seasoned with absence and regret. Leo regressed devastatingly. He not only stopped whispering, but he completely abandoned his colored pencils and modeling clay. He spent his days sitting in a corner, apathetic, refusing to eat and staring into space. Helen continued her visits and, with a chilling coldness, diagnosed it as a necessary phase. But Arthur, watching the light fade from his son's eyes day after day, knew that this wasn't treatment, it was torture. The house was a mirror of his mistake, and every silent room screamed Clara's name. The breaking point came a week later. Arthur found Leo clutching the small felt lion, the only trace of Clara's presence, with silent tears streaming down his face. The image shattered what was left of Arthur's pride and fear. He understood, with a brutal clarity, that the solution was not in new specialists, but in righting his wrong. Driven by a desperation that overcame all his insecurities, he went out to look for her. After a few calls, he found the address of her new job. Clara was in an office building in a uniform, cleaning the floor of an impersonal hallway. The woman who had performed a miracle in his home was there, on her knees, completely invisible to the world. He called her name, his voice hoarse. Clara turned, surprise on her face quickly giving way to a cold, distant expression. "I made a mistake," Arthur said, the words tumbling out. "I was a coward. I was afraid of what people would think, afraid of confronting Helen, and because of my fear, I'm losing my son all over again." He approached her, exposing all his vulnerability. "But the truth is, I didn't just come back for him. I came back for me, because I love you, Clara." The confession, made in that cold hallway under the fluorescent lights, was the most honest truth he had ever spoken, stripped of his wealth and status. Clara listened, her heart torn between the hurt of betrayal and the sincerity she saw in his eyes. "Your words are nice, Arthur, but they're not enough," she replied, with a new, surprising firmness. "If you want me back, you'll have to truly fight. Not just for us, but against her." That's when Clara revealed everything she had. Discovered the story of Richard Miller, the pattern of manipulation, the text messages that proved Helen's bad faith. "She won't stop. We need to expose her," she said, proposing a trap. The condition for her return was not just a declaration of love, but an act of courage. He would have to stand with her to see justice done. That very night, the trap was set. Arthur called Helen, asking her to come to his house urgently. He received her pretending to be tormented, saying he missed Clara and was thinking of rehiring her. Helen's reaction was immediate. She scolded him, saying he was being weak and that he deserved someone on his level. Arthur cornered her. "Someone like you?" Visibly nervous, Helen denied it, but he delivered the final blow. "You hate her so much because you want me for yourself, don't you? Just like you did with Richard Miller's wife." His name landed like a bomb in the room, and Helen's face transformed into a mask of panic and fury. "How dare you say that name?" "To me," she screamed, losing all control. "He was a terrible father, just like you're being now by letting yourself be led by a—" She didn't finish the sentence. "And I recorded every word," said Clara, stepping out from behind the curtain, her cell phone in her hand. At that exact instant, Leo ran down the stairs, and upon seeing Clara, a cry of pure joy escaped his throat. "Clara, you're back!" He ran and threw himself into her arms, the image of the boy, radiant, embracing the woman, Helen. Tried to destroy in front of the man she tried to seduce was the psychologist's final defeat. She had lost on all fronts. "You'll pay for this," Helen hissed. But the threat sounded empty. "No, Helen, you're the one who's going to pay," Arthur replied, with a calmness he hadn't felt in years. "This recording, along with Richard's evidence, will be sent to the Board of Psychology tomorrow morning." Defeated, humiliated, and exposed, Helen grabbed her purse and left that house, never to return. In the center of the room, Arthur, Clara, and Leo embraced. The battle was over. In that hug, they were no longer the employer, the employee, and the sick child. They were a family, forged not in luxury or convenience, but in pain, regret, and the courage to fight for the truth, proving that true love does not fear judgment, only absence. A powerful story about courage, manipulation, and the love that heals all wounds. What did you think of the ending? Was justice served? Leave your opinion in the comments. Give a like if you were moved, and don't forget to subscribe to receive our new stories every day. The next one could be about you.